Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
Less than a season into his reign as Manchester United manager, Erik ten Hag has brought home the first bit of silverware, thanks to goals by Casemiro and a Botman own goal. The XG indicated it was a closer match, but what did ten Hag do tactically to bring the trophy home? And how did Howe give him such a tough time, especially early on? Let's take a look. And Newcastle actually generally dominated on the ball. And this wasn't just some scoreline effect, as even before Newcastle went behind, they had almost 60% possession. Initially, Newcastle would look to build up in a 4-1-4-1, with Bruno being the solo pivot looking to build up the play. However, Manchester United anticipated this, and a big role for Fernandes was to pretty much man-mark Bruno as much as he could in the build-up. At the same time, Casemiro and Fred could pick up their men man-to-man, and as we've seen ten Hag likes to do, he would bring Rashford using a curved press onto the centre-back, trying to cut off the passing lane to Trippier to apply pressure to one centre-back, whilst Weghorst moved onto the other one. In these situations, central progression was extremely difficult for Newcastle, so we would see Longstaff look to come deep alongside Bruno to be a secondary option, but Fred could easily back up the press, leaving Casemiro deeper to potentially deal with the threat of Joelinton. All of this meant that it was extremely difficult for Newcastle to build up through the centre at times. But Newcastle did adapt, as soon enough they were using a more dedicated back three, with Dan Burn tucking in at left centre back, so that at least they had a 3 versus 2 in this stage, making it a little easier to keep possession and much less likely to make individual mistakes when being pressed 1-1. And in the first half, Howe used Almiron as a key factor to allow them to play through the centre at times, as he didn't necessarily stick to the flanks, often drifting infield into the half space. This would mean that Casemiro couldn't remain as touch tight on Joelinton, as he had to have one eye on Almiron, especially with Trippier in this region being a threat for sure. So, at times, Joelinton in this region would be able to receive more progressive passes. Ten Hag did adapt to this as well, because with Burn deeper, we could see Antony operating slightly narrower to try and cut off the passing lane towards Joelinton. So here we see United pressing with their front two of Weghorst and Rashford, and pretty much going man-to-man in the midfield. And in this case, Casemiro has actually gone touch-tight to Joelinton, so Trippier is the free man. So when Trippier receives, Shaw was being drawn forward as Rashford was initially central. So Almiron, who had moved into the more central position, much like Joelinton, on the far side can then receive. So as you can see, Casemiro had 2 men to pick up, and Martinez backs this up instead. So with the centre being more difficult, the flanks were extremely important for Newcastle, particularly with Antony at times being caught narrower. Down the left-hand side, the goal was clear, to simply isolate Saint-Maximin against Dalot, as Saint-Maximin is an elite dribbler who could get past his man and look to create havoc and chances for his teammates, which we saw a lot of. But it was perhaps down the right where Newcastle were more adventurous. When Almiron did tuck in to these more central regions, Shaw began to be drawn in at times, and what this created was the opportunity for Trippier on the far side to overlap and get into dangerous crossing positions, which we saw plenty of. Almiron is between the lines, so Shaw has to keep an eye on him. When Almiron received, it was immediately wide to Trippier, and he and the rest of the side can then make moves into the box. And the run from Longstaff leads to a dangerous cross. We often saw that Almiron didn't have to tuck in. He could just start wide, receive the first pass, and still get support from Trippier overlapping him. Again, the goal being to get an elite crosser in Trippier into good positions. Here again we see a situation where Rashford is higher and Trippier has gone beyond him. So now there's a 2 versus 1 against Shaw, and this time it's Almiron in advance of Shaw so he can receive. But this Rashford positioning wasn't just about the opportunity to press a centre back. What it meant is that when there was a turnover, he was in the perfect position to make runs behind Trippier for the counter-attack, and he, Fernandes and Antony would often lead the charge on the transition. But in this match we again saw Ten Hag's elite in-game management. As in the second half when United were ahead anyway, we saw him make some changes that helped to consolidate their position. First of all, Wan-Bissaka came on for Dalot because he is elite in 1 versus 1 situations, which was what was needed against Saint-Maximin, and eventually Saint-Maximin had to be taken off in the second half. But Weghorst also came on, as did Fred, with his position being taken up by McTominay, and Sabitzer also came on. So this allowed Rashford to become the centre forward, McTominay alongside Casemiro, and Fernandes to be off to the left-hand side. In the same instance, Newcastle had taken off Longstaff and brought on Isak and switched to a double pivot of Bruno and Joe Linton. So with this dedicated double pivot, the pressing energy of Sabitzer was much more effective in looking to close down Bruno, whilst McTominay has a similar type of profile, so they were able to more effectively shut down the double pivots. In addition, whilst Isak did pick up good positions, he wasn't being found between the lines as often as Joe Linton was, for example. On the left, Rashford when he was out wide initially, as well as Fernandes when he was moved there, now defended much narrower, making it much more difficult for Newcastle to make the most of Almiron in that inside position. But in the first half, Ten Hag also identified things that he could take advantage of when United were in possession, so let's take a look at those. When United had the ball, Newcastle generally defended in a fairly flat 4-5-1, where despite Bruno being in the centre, he wasn't a defensive midfielder of sorts and more of a 4-1-4-1, so that shape was much flatter. What this meant is that there was a little bit more space between the lines, and Ten Hag, as we've seen, loves using Casemiro as a sole pivot, so at times Fred and Fernandes could find a little bit more space between the lines. Here we see that flatter midfield shape, Casemiro the sole pivot, and the potential for men to find space between those lines. And down United's right hand side, we saw the reason why Dalot started. Saint-Maximin, either through a tactical choice or just his natural playing traits, would tend to be drawn higher up the pitch and could be caught out of position defensively, although it did position him, much like Rashford, in a good part of the pitch to use his pace on the transition. But what we did see is that it allowed Antony to hug the touchline, and Dalot was highly aggressive from fullback in looking to underlap into these regions. So on a few occasions, we saw Antony receive the ball, draw burn, and Dalot make that run and look to get dangerous crosses into the box. So here we see Saint-Maximin is out of shot, and Dalot has identified the opportunity for a 2 versus 1. His run initially draws burn, allowing the switch to Antony, and once burn is drawn to Antony, Dalot can look for space, and he can get the cross in. But in more open play situations, we saw the advantages and disadvantages of that flat 5. When it worked well, despite the shape being fairly flat, having so many men centrally could mean that it would still be difficult to find these tiny gaps to penetrate between the lines. However, on the rare occasions where those opportunities did present themselves, we saw Weghorst looking to drop between the lines, and he and Rashford's partnership, which is developing well, saw the Englishman make the run to get into dangerous positions, which did lead to their own goal as well. So we see that flatter midfield and Weghorst between the lines. In this scenario, he actually is found. He is then able to flick the ball into the on-running Rashford, leading to a potentially dangerous situation. Overall, Newcastle did pretty well, especially early on, but the quick-fire goals took all the wind out of their sails. This trophy is physical proof of United's progress under Ten Hag, and maybe the first of many just this season alone. For the manager tactical score, both did well, and Howe earns a 7, being undone by a set piece and heavy deflection, but Ten Hag also did well, particularly with his in-game adjustments to see out the match, earning him a 7.5. But what are your ratings? Drop them down below.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out. But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.